Hello, Wake Up New Zealand, Carol Saiki speaking. And I want to go over some more research material that I've found. Now, speaking about Maranga Mai. Now, that's a report that was commissioned by the New Zealand government, and the focus is it's 160 pages, and it's focusing on white supremacy, white privilege, colonialism, decolonialism, and racist, intergenerational, colonials, and this goes on and on about this over this all these pages. So it also makes recommendations. Well, it also negatively talks about the introduction of Christianity, health, and also education into New Zealand by the colonials. And it calls for one government for Maori and a co-governance for all. That's all others, with iwi leaders and government. Commissioned by the government, instrumental by the National Iwi Chairs Forum. Margaret Mutu is a key person in that. And the Human Rights Commission, Meng Foon and Claire Charters, and other iwi Maori. This is to fully adopt into the government policy-making decisions, regulations at local and central level of government, the recommendations by this report to fully implement the He Puapua into government policies, legislation at central and local government level, and also the 2007 UNDRIP, United Nations Declarations of Indigenous Peoples' Rights. Now, Rosemary Banks in 2007 actually went to the UN, and she represented the Labour-led government there that rejected the UNDRIP, the UN Declaration, because of many reasons, saying that it would give Maori veto rights over others, that they would own all the land in New Zealand, whereas, it was already legally owned by Maori and non-Maori, and this could not happen. It wasn't practical for New Zealand law. It wasn't compliant to the treaty, and it would mean there would be a two-class citizenship of New Zealand. It's two classes of citizens, an apartheid. So this is what the government has commissioned with the Iwi Chairs Forum of New Zealand and others that are involved. So this declaration, UN declaration, was called a declaration of aspiration. Many countries didn't see this as being legally actually a legislation level, but just a document of aspiration. So Horemaya, he was the Minister of Maori Affairs under Labour. In September 2007, he gave a speech in Parliament, and he actually confirmed what Rosemary Banks was saying, and he warned Parliament not to go along to adopt this UN declaration. He told the Maori Party to get their heads up the sand because there were members of Maori political activist groups that had actually been part of the 10-year planning of the UNDRIP prior to 2007. So there you go. So there was a lot of this going on. And then Doug Graham in 1999 gave another speech in Parliament where the Maori Council said that they were going to go to APEC countries and ask them to support Maori sovereignty using the 1835 Declaration. Well, Doug Graham, who was a treaties minister, claims, said, look here, you can't do that because if you want that, you've got to give up the treaty and then you can't have the treaty and Maori sovereignty. And he said, I doubt that you're going to give up treaty claims. And he said the APEC countries would not even be interested in what they have to say. And he spoke about a Judge Timms who had earlier said that no, they could not have both. They can't have their cake and eat it. So that had happened back then. So after that, we had the word Indigenous, because prior to 1970, it wasn't used in New Zealand. It doesn't matter what papers say, it was not used. So what happened? The Indian Brotherhood that was introduced by Andrew Paul. He was the president of the Indian Brotherhood in Canada. Well, he introduced the word Indigenous into the modern day language. Indigenous is actually rooted from a Latin word meaning beget, within, and several meanings. And some say, well, it's difficult to even put the meaning to it. And this is what's being said. So anyhow, he passed away, and this George Manuel, also of the Indian Brotherhood, actually took on the president's role. Now, Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, actually gave him centre stage across the nation of Canada to preach this word of Indigenous, of Native peoples. So George Manuel then established the World Council of Indigenous Peoples. And at the first forum that was held in the UN Hall of Assembly, a number of delegates actually walked out in protest because they had no knowledge of this Indigenous, and they certainly hadn't signed consent or given consent for them to be called Indigenous. So they walked out in protest. Anyhow, going further on, in 1970, we had a Canadian delegation come to New Zealand, and in that delegation was George Manuel. So he wanted to look across New Zealand, see what Maori are doing and the sort of place they're living in. And his goal was to actually indoctrinate this Indigenous classification for all global nations, native nations, into New Zealand. So that was one label, Indigenous, for all native nations across the world. So after he'd been given days out with the delegation, they looked across Maori entertainment and all sorts of stuff. Then a night after this, George Manuel invited Maori politicians and Maori entertainers to his hotel room, where he talked very serious talk about Indigenous and natives across the world, native Maori being called Indigenous. And this is where it's come from. This is exactly where it's come from. So that's the history around that. So think about this. What is introduced globally actually is actioned locally. So let's look at that. We've got the UN WEF, World Economic Forum, that signed a partnership memorandum, official partnership memorandum, 13th of June 2019, 5 months before the pandemic. So you're looking at, well, the UN, they were running out of money, out of political power around accelerating UN Agenda 2030. Now, Ardern was the first to actually enter this into domestic policy, this non-binding agreement, making it binding legally in New Zealand, first of all those countries. Anyhow, with this, this memorandum, this official memorandum of UN and WEF, this made them a global public-private partnership, a co-governance of the world, because the clout that the UN got to accelerate that was more billions of dollars to do it, and all these UN nation state leaders who gathered at the UN. And then you have the philanthropists, then the academics, the corporations, so it could all happen. So here you have a corporate capture under UN international laws. So it happened globally. Now look at it locally. So here we have iwi Maori elite, public-private partnership, co-governance, and transnational corporations like BlackRock doing a transnational corporate partnership with the New Zealand government. You see what I mean? So what's in this? I mean, we're seeing, I'm seeing a lot of reports across the world about land grabs, etc. Oh, by the way, the UNDRIP, it also said that Maori had the right to all natural resources in New Zealand. So if you look at that alone, New Zealand is very wealthy in its natural resources. We have coal, gold, silver, iron sand, aggregate, limestone, pumice, dermalite, salt, serpenite, zeolite, bentonite, phosphate. We're really well known back in history. It goes on historically about how much oil and gas we have. Think of onshore, offshore. We could be self-sufficient, but no, what have we got going on? We've got iwi elite with the government pushing UN Agenda 2030, a corporate capture. And this is what's happening in New Zealand. It's the deliberate plundering of a free market economy for a corporate capture of a multi-stakeholder capitalism, to destroy small businesses, to destroy farmers, to bring in agribusiness, drones, land grabs. And this is what's happening in New Zealand. And it's happening right now. So the politicians, all those political cronies in the cesspit of Wellington, will not tell you this. None of them. When they go around on their campaigns, you ask them about this. I'm going to put a hard copy of this actually on my website today, so please go and check it out. It actually has the link to this Maranga My 160-page report. You can also go on the parliamentary website. You can find Doug Graham's. In fact, I will put the link of that on there as well as to the Maori Council and also Hori Myers and also Rosemary Banks UN DRIP. You can check it out all for yourself. Wake up, New Zealand.